All right, I think we are ready to begin. Good evening. My name is Keisha Rogers, and I want to welcome you to tonight's strategic discussion and overview for Monday, August the 22nd. And I'll be joined tonight by Michael Steger. And our discussion, the topic theme of our discussion tonight is, will Republicans blow the midterms or fight like Trump? And before I turn it over to Michael, a couple of things that I want to bring to your attention is, as many of you know, last week, those who participated in the discussion that I held with Tony Pappert, we discussed in the beginning the role of the FBI and its ongoing attacks against the citizens of our republic, against Donald Trump in what has happened with the recent raid at Mar-A-Lago, and how this has been a continuation of what Lyndon LaRouche identified when the same criminal apparatus were going after him as a rotten permanent bureaucracy. Last week, I played a short clip by Mr. LaRouche, and as he indicated and as he made very clear in the aftermath of his trial and the attack coming from people like Robert Mueller and the FBI DOJ operations that are the same operations that have been nonstop in their criminal actions to destroy our nation, our republic, and what they've recently done against President Donald Trump. As LaRouche made clear, until we remove from our system of government a rotten criminal bureaucracy, that a permanent rotten permanent bureaucracy, this country nor anyone in it is free. And I think that what that means when we're talking about removing this rotten bureaucracy, the question that is very much has to be made clear to everyone is, in these next 2 months leading into the November election, what we will determine the future of our nation is if the Republican Party, the party that Trump identified of the working men, the working women, can actually live up to that mission, the mission of the foundation of what Abraham Lincoln founded the party on, and to once again emerge as the leading voice in our nation. And that is determined by understanding that right now it's not just enough to go with hot button issues, that we actually have to take on a new system of government, which Michael will discuss here tonight, is something that has been identified by a recent article that was written by Susan Kokenda. And the title of the article, I'll pull it up here in just a moment, which is very fitting for the fight that we're embarking on, is What the Enemy Knows About 2022 and 2024. It's more than elections, it's the end of their system. And this is really addressing the fact that, as many people know, the question is not just dealing with the issues of today, but how do we actually bring about a new system of government reflecting those very principles of the American system of political economy. As many of you know, LaRouche PAC has been waging a major fight around the initiative of hands off Trump, creating a third American economic revolution. And that has been the feature of a petition that we've been discussing and disseminating throughout the country, getting petition signatures on, and that will be delivered prior to the upcoming November elections, which we're indicating those who are serious about running for office, and not only running for office, but about actually leading the Republican Party to advance around the needed economic solutions, they have to start discussing these solutions. And those solutions are being taken up or picked up by a number of people, including the idea that the ending of the Federal Reserve, as we've called for, is a number one priority. Many people may have seen this, and you may be saying, whoa, there are a lot of people who are echoing what LaRouche PAC has been saying on the need to put an end to the Federal Reserve system. But that doesn't go far enough. As we've said, it has to be replaced with a new system of credit. And this is what is identified, a credit going back to the standards of a Hamiltonian national banking system. This is what has been identified in the recent article that you'll find on larouchepac.com that Susan Kokinda has written in terms of what has to be taken up for the solutions needed to pull the nation out of the ongoing calamity. Now, the other thing, as has been indicated in the discussion, has been, as said, there have been numerous pieces, and this has been taken up by Barbara Boyd. And let me see if I can pull this up real quick. Here we go. I'll show you these two reports that I think are critical. If you haven't read this weekend, on titled "Just Saying the DOJ FBI crooks are the real Mar-A-Lago scandal," what Barbara, in her opening to this piece, discusses is two articles that really go after the whole operation. It's called the Panty raid on Mar-A-Lago. And one of the pieces is by Paul Sperry over at Real Clear Investigations. And I would encourage people to go and read this article. The beginning of Sperry's article actually takes up going back to how the operation, the coup being run against Trump, started back in 2016 with a whole investigation that was named as Crossfire Hurricane. And you can read about this. One thing that people may remember is that at the center of that whole operation with Robert Mueller, the Russiagate investigations, was by a man by the name of the name of Peter Strzok. And Peter Strzok was heading up this whole Crossfire Hurricane operation, along with, this was the guy who was putting out nasty tweets about Trump, and at the time working with the DOJ FBI operations, and that was having a relationship with a married woman in the Justice Department as well. So Lisa Page, I believe her name was. But I'm bringing this up because this whole operation has been ongoing. The same people who were going after Trump in 2016, Peter Strzok is still in the news media. He is still out there defending his actions, and was adopted by MSNBC and all of these other criminal apparatus. But at the same time, what has to be made clear is that Trump is fighting. And the fight he understands is that we have to, as LaRouche called for, end this criminal permanent bureaucracy, but we also have to give the American people an idea of the future. What are we fighting for? And that's what we're going to be talking about here tonight. I encourage you, again, this is the article that I was referencing, What the Enemy Knows About 2022 and 2024, More Than Elections. It's the end of their system. And we have to make sure that we do put an end to the globalist British system and bring about the type of system that the America was truly founded on, and to give people a sense of optimism to the future. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Michael to discuss the war and discuss what we really have to embark upon at this moment in time. One.
Great,
There
thanks,
you go.
Keisha. Hi, everyone. So Keisha made a couple of important points that I want to stress in my opening remarks. And I want to go back to Tony Pappert's thesis last week, that with the raid on Mar-A-Lago, which is in some ways paraphrasing what Tony stated, that the raid at Mar-A-Lago by the FBI was a declaration of total war. And that is that there is no turning back. They've made it explicit in broad daylight that they are looking to achieve complete control, police state-like measures, control over information, control over the dissemination of information, control over any political parties and representation. And of course, this has huge blowback because the population at this point is fighting. And many people that may not have been encouraged to realize the only thing standing between their children and grandchildren and this kind of fascist state is them. And in some warfare, or when we reference war, there's combat, there's artillery combat, there's warfare in its traditional understood sense, a deployment of military troops and equipment and capability to then annihilate or threaten to annihilate another military force. But real war, as it's come to be known, especially in the since the 20th century, is a question of a devotion. And this in some ways goes back to the classical sense of warfare that we saw from the Athenians against the Persian invasions. That it's a question of sacrifice and devotion of everything you possibly can sacrifice to secure your nation and your civilization. And to a large extent, that FBI raid indicates that there is a clear path to victory. But that pathway is really defined by a kind of sacrifice of devotion, of brotherhood with our citizenry and even with mankind, to make all the sacrifices necessary to secure that against the clear enemy. Now, what Keisha referenced from the article posted on the website tonight, an article by Susan Kokinda regarding the upcoming election and the kind of ditherings of the Republican Party who want to run on Biden is bad, there's inflation, there's crime, there's a few things going on that are bad. But in general, the uniparty in Washington does not want either party to be annihilated. You need both parties. So a massive rout of the Democrats, a historic rout, and then again, another one in 2024 and subsequent ones in 2026 could literally leave the party in shatters. There are already threats of splitting it. There's a corporatist centrist party with Andrew Yang ready to break off. I think it's called Forward, basically the Macron party of the United States. There is a People's Party on the far left, largely kind of green fanatics, but another like Medicare for all. But there's all kinds of expressions of this. So McConnell's dithering is intended. They want to keep the so-called duopoly of the parties in line and keep control. And McConnell has no interest. There's a clear ego assessment, I would say, ego battle between McConnell and Trump. He would do everything possible to undercut Trump, to continue to allow even what he's already given, these so-called legislative victories to Biden. They're really satanic in nature. They're by no means victories. The CHIPS bill, the infrastructure bill, the healthcare green bill, these are things are just totally destructive. But the point Susan makes is that, yes, there is sabotage of this midterm. There is an intent to undermine Republican candidates, and the growing red wave of outrage towards Biden and this entire DC regime. what's oftentimes been called the Washington consensus. There is outrage from the American people towards this. They're not surviving. They don't see civilization. They see increased crime, anarchy, rife, rage, inflation, unemployment, working multiple jobs. There is not contentment. And yet, some, as Susan references, including Tucker Carlson, have made references to issues they could run on: the border, the crime. Nixon won a landslide victory in 1972 on law and order. These are references. But the greater point is that it's time to assert that we are going to overthrow this system. That's what the Mar-a-Lago raid implies. Either they are going to defend the system at all cost. They're going to basically scream and shout as like a neurotic housewife when you basically bring historical reality to bear, that the whole society outside her quaint suburb is going to absolute hell, and you've got to do something about it. They're going to scream as much as possible. They're going to deploy the FBI. They want to secure their system. They will bail out the banks. They will print whatever money. They will bail out the green agenda. They'll do everything possible to secure their system. They've become servants to this system. And that really the commitment of this movement, this American patriotic movement, is to overthrow that system. Well, tonight's discussion in some ways to help, I guess, help each of us, and from you, to including with your feedback, how we communicate a systemic change to the population. The problem with describing systems is that people have a hard time identifying, what do you mean by system? We're talking everything. I mean, the churches have all wrought. We had someone recently said, I don't call myself a Christian anymore because what does that mean? I mean, it could mean anything, which is true because of the way the Christian churches have manifest. Universities, college education. I mean, I know for some people, it's a new revelation that we're brainwashing our students. I can tell you it was happening 25 years ago from personal experience, and I'm sure others could give evidence of it much earlier. I'm talking like hardcore, human beings are the problem. We're a plague on the planet. We need to be lowered in terms of population numbers, kind of brainwashing, what you'd expect from a cult meeting you're paying 50 grand or 30 grand a year for. Our entire economic system, our entire banking system, as Keisha referenced, the Federal Reserve, which is really a core feature of this global system. But going through all of that with the person and the organizing dynamic is a little bit, it can be tiresome, it can be exhaustive, and people get bored and roll their eyes and move on. So as with poetry or music or good jokes or any communication, as with science or scientific evaluation, to define a system, you need action which could only be taking place within a system that is rotten. In this case, that if our hypothesis is that the system is so rotten, the only option is its replacement, then, and for candidates to run on that basis, they need to be able to make an exhaustive case that this entire system is rotten to its core and has to be fundamentally replaced, and to provide a sense of that replacement by a very quick and efficient demonstration. Good jokes are efficient. Any good comedian will tell you efficiency is key, timing is key. The same is true within physical science. You need an efficient assessment of a system that is definitive. It clearly defines something that is outside the scope of what people had expected. In this case, what we're talking about is, are the demands of a population being met sufficiently to say we can tweak the system? We could just close the border. We could hire some more police. We could do a little reform or investigation of the NHS and how it NIH and how it handled CDC, how it handled COVID. We could do a congressional review of the FBI and DOJ and find out kind of what's happened there that's gone a little wrong. We're talking that this whole thing is gone. And we want to make that case. Now, many of you may have participated in a discussion we had a number of weeks ago, where based on an excursion to New York, I covered what's actually happened to our inner cities. That a place like New York with 8 million people had 8 million people 60 years ago. And 1 million of them were involved in industrial manufacturing of some degree. And I'm saying by industrial, I mean not craft manufacturing, not boutique manufacturing, industrial of some broader, industrial mass scale. Now there's something like maybe 70, 80,000, 100,000, a massive shift. At that time, it was 30% of the employed people in New York who were working in industrial production. And what that tells you is that if New York was somewhat isolated from the world, even though you'd still have to get raw materials in, but to a large extent, if it was isolated, it could still replicate itself. It was to some degree autonomous, to some degree. But that's been entirely ripped out. It's been ripped out of New York. It's been ripped out of Chicago, Detroit, Los Angeles. These were our big four industrial powerhouses. So in that context, I want to cover what's transpired in some ways since. And many of you may be familiar with this. And it stems from a polemic on the question of warfare. Because some people may say that to use the term war is either too provocative, it references that politics has failed, it's somehow, a kind of reaction to January 6th, and that we should put our language in very pacific terms. Some people are just cowards and think that references of war will somehow ignite nuclear war around the world. It's a bit of kind of mysticism. But as I said earlier, war is a sense of a devotion. It calls up a context of which, if you don't do whatever is necessary, the consequences would be a complete overhaul of your system of government, who's in power, and ultimately the priorities and commitments of that government. And in this case, we're talking a complete loss of our constitutional system, a deprivation of its population, a total collapse of any of its manufacturing and production, any sense of autonomy, a massive reduction of its power supply. I mean, in Europe, in England, for example, the current regime's enforcement of shutting down all energy supply in the so-called, ostensibly on the basis of the Russian-Ukraine war, the energy prices of an average home in England have gone from £100 to what is now £500 in the course of 6 months. Now that hasn't manifested entirely. We'll see what happens. They raise rates twice a year. That's coming up in September in England, where the rates would then potentially raise by that amount of money. This is to basically kill populations, to lower massive consumption, to lower quality of life, and to lower life expectancy. That's what that does. And that's what this regime would do in the United States if it consolidates power. So in some sense, what other reference could one make? But to provoke that response is to provoke in people a sense that the consequences are tangibly at that level, that it's not hyperbole. Well, I think it's worth then taking a consideration at what's been happening in our country, especially over the last 20 years. If you take the last 50 years, from the end of the 60s till now, there's been approximately 1.3 million people who have died from drug overdose. So 1.3 million in 50 years. In the course of that time frame, in the last 20 years, of that 1.3 million, 1.1 million died in the last 20 years. So 30 years, from 1970 to 2000, that 30-year period, about 200,000 people died. The lowest point was around 1982, around the time that we actually declared a war on drugs. At that point, within that year, 2,500 people died in that 1 year. Today, this last year, 2021, for the first time, over 100,000 people died. I'm sorry. Yeah, over 100,000 people died of drug overdose. And that far exceeds the deaths in Vietnam. In the last 5 years, the same time period, which equals the duration of our civil war, 500,000 approximately have died of drug overdose in this country. That's equivalent to the deaths in the Civil War. Now, the population was about 1/10, about 30 plus million at the time. So that would be today 5 million in a civil war. But equivalent, a war we have lost, the greatest losses of American life were in the Civil War. And within that same time frame, just 500,000 have died of drug overdose in this country. That doesn't incorporate the millions who have become drug addicted and will have psychological, emotional, intellectual, and physical effects, injuries, casualties from that drug addiction for the rest of their life. The millions. And currently probably operating in the United States, there are tens of millions of people either currently addicted or recovering addicts from drug addiction. And at what other context would we look at this kind of loss of life and not be willing to recognize that there is something drastically wrong? But some people might say, well, that's why we've got to close the border. Fair point. We should seal the border, and we should target anyone trafficking drugs as a high-level criminal offense with severe punishment. But we're also legalizing drugs all over the country. Marijuana is by no means a safe and easy drug. THC levels in marijuana have gone up to 50, 60%, and in some cases 95, 98% when you're talking vaping. And the levels of psychosis, if anyone smoked pot, paranoia, that's just a kind of common street recognition. But there is clear psychosis, violence, and a loss of intellectual and emotional capacity. And the clear addiction. I mean, because there's MA. Now, so what was the actual cause of the drug culture? Well, the drug culture was brought in not by Mexican cartels or other traffickers. The drugs were brought in to leading colleges and universities in the 1960s. And I reference that because we're looking at who are we going to wage this war against? Now, the reference today is globalism. But in reality, that reference point of massive drugs, and President Trump made reference to this in one of his recent rallies, in referencing the opium wars, because he's well aware of this, and he talks about it. These blue ribbon committees. Everybody wants to be on a well-intended, feel-good, fuzzy-feeling blue ribbon committee. We're going to solve the drug problem, but they get nothing done. They've got no teeth. You're fighting a war. People want to. The people that have deployed this drugs and this culture are intending for mass death. And you're going to set up a blue ribbon committee and say, how do we set up more methadone clinics? Doesn't function. Ask China what it did. to clean up its opium wars. It's a tough, brutal process. People want to deal with homelessness in a kind and gentle way. You're going to have to get people off the streets. You have to set up public mental health hospitals and put a lot of the Congress in them as well. But we're going to have to be tough because people are worth something. People can contribute something, but you've got to fight for it. It doesn't just happen because you want to be nice. And the people that brought in these drugs are the Rockefellers, the CIA. This isn't something, this deep state didn't start in 9/11. This is British imperial policy. It's not surprising that Tavistock Institute, the same people that were running these kinds of tests back in the 50s and 60s, were also running a massive transgender clinic for children that just got shut down in Great Britain because of so many gross violations of natural law that parents were outraged. Okay, so that's true. Now we've, and most of you probably are aware of that. That's not surprising. But we're talking 500,000 deaths. Millions of people have become addicted. Tens of millions of people in this country today walking around either as addicts of some narcotic or in recovery. Most of the people that have died and have just become addicted in the last 5 years are young people, and many of them are young men. Is this not a war? Is this not an intended and deployed war against the country? Where is the greatest concentration of these drug deaths? Where do we find them? We find them in inner cities. We find them in small towns, former industrial. We've seen a complete intended, how could it not be intended? It's happened in every part of the country on massive scale for nonstop for 50 years. A globalization, outsourcing, shutdown of American industry, not just in the small industrial town, in the big industrial cities, which were the powerhouse of our industrial engine. What do you bomb when you're in a war with a nation of an industrial scale war? Well, unless you're Harry Truman and British utopian advisors, you target industrial centers. We have been under an assault on our nation for 50 years. It's been a direct, maybe undeclared, but who cares what people say? Look at what they do. Look at what this system does. It deindustrializes, as in an act of war, our major industrial productive centers. It implements or introduces an anti-science, anti-human, environmentalist cult, and then deploys a drug culture that maps itself almost perfectly to the former industrial centers and heartlands of our country. Now, as I said, the effect of this took time, so that within the last 5 years, we've seen almost half of all drug deaths over the last 50. But is that not an indication that the system is failing? It's failing young people. We've lost control of any sense of a future. And the only way to change that is not merely to restrict the drug flow, which is key, but to immediately implement a mission, a focus, a development of the country that we're going to rebuild and provide a future and bring young people out of this darkness. Is that not what the platform for the campaigns today should be? And it can be done. We have the full scope. Imagine deploying the NSA and other national security capabilities to eradicate the illicit drug flow, to deploy our border supply and DHS and other factors to monitor all the drugs coming into the country, whether it's in San Diego, whether it's through Mexico, whether it's through other ports, that we identify, document it, and go after the international syndicates. Instead of targeting its political opposition, the FBI or other police agencies, the US Marshals, CIA, would be deployed towards international drug cartels. That we were declared a war on that enemy. And I can tell you that when you touch the drug question, the globalists will always respond. They know this is their hallmark card. They believe they can control populations, control the banking, control the cash supply, control culture through the control of the drug trade. And so it's this kind of what you might call a so-called issue, what people might describe as an issue. But under these current circumstances, with the dramatic escalation that's happened within just a few years, it is recognized that we have to change an entire philosophical conception of what we're devoted to, that no system dedicated towards a viable future for our nation or mankind could ever create the result that I've just described. And it's this sense we have to escalate any campaign out there. So we're asking you to mobilize. We have now 2.5 months until November 8th, the midterm election. We have to secure the House. We have to secure the key swing states that are going to determine the presidential election, meaning their state governments, their governors, secretaries of state, and so on. And we can, unbeknownst to Mitch McConnell, we can mobilize effectively and secure the Senate, giving us an ability to control the agenda in the Senate, have impeachment hearings over a number of officials in this regime, but also begin to put forth real legislation that can be brought to bear, if not sooner, then certainly by the next incoming administration. That's possible, but it happens because some citizens recognize that the power of history does not exist in so-called significant individuals, the named individuals, the senators or the congressmen or the governors. And it doesn't happen because of a mass of a population. The power to transform our nation's orientation today, the power embedded within human history, is part of a necessary part of creation itself. Mankind must advance. If we become immoral and depraved, we will suffer consequences. And the opportunity to shift that comes at unique moments. At those moments, it is what some may consider insignificant, but I would assert here, determinative acts of courage around the potential we have, given forcefully, dramatically, and timely, that awakens in the hearts and minds of a people a sense that yes, the system can fundamentally change. We have every moral ground to reject this system, to call all of it into question, and to assert that the very basis of that new system is to secure a viable future, both in the short term, meaning the livelihoods of these young people today, and over the coming generations of our citizenry and of mankind. And that's really what we have available to us today. And this election is that important. We cannot leave it up to these marketing firms. Many of the groups who have sprung up in the recent period operate off of Madison Avenue marketing techniques. What are their symbols? What are their logos? What are their slogans? What do their websites look like? All of that, of course, has some value. I'm not discounting it, but it does not shape the course of history. What shapes the course of history are those unrecognized acts of courage that are the antithesis to the kind of apathetic cowardice that the population has been walking in for decades. That comes from average people who have the courage to recognize what's at stake and what's also possible. So I think that really is the circumstances today. Hopefully that develops it in some effective terms. I'll leave my comments there, see what you guys are thinking, and have the discussion tonight.